Thank you very much, Tim. I would like to start by just saying a few words of gratitude. I'm very appreciative to ODI for hosting this event, and to Rachel and to Anna McCord for making the arrangements for this. It's very important that we disseminate the findings from this evaluation broadly to a wide range of stakeholders. So I'm very pleased to be here in London to do this. Tomorrow I'll be in Oslo. NORAD is hosting a similar event for Scandinavian countries, so to be able to share the findings broadly as well. Also, thank you very much, Tim, for being here to chair this and for DFID's continuing interest in this. A few words of context for this evaluation. This is an evaluation of the last 10 years, 2000 to 2010, a global evaluation of the bank's assistance for social safety nets. The need for social safety nets has really been underscored the last few years with the food, fuel, and financial crisis. Some estimates are that 65 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. 65 million additional people pushed into extreme poverty as a result of these crises. And it doesn't look like these types of crises are going away, with increasing food prices, with globalization making countries more sensitive to shocks that happen around the world, as well as global climatic change. So it's a very important area. It's the first time IEG has evaluated the bank's work on social safety nets. The bank has done about $11.5 billion worth of lending in about 250 projects in 85 countries. It's a very active area, and a lot of this has happened in the last few years. So it's important and timely to take a careful look at this evaluation. I should note as well, as Laura will speak to later, the bank is also doing its own reflection on the past decade, as it's in the process of putting together a strategy, a new social protection strategy. The last one was done a decade ago, and now they're putting together a new one, a forward-looking strategy. So Laura will have a chance to speak to that. Okay, so just a word about IEG, this independent evaluation group of the World Bank. It's part of the World Bank, but it's also separate from the bank. We report to the World Bank Group's board of directors, not the president of the World Bank. And we're here as a source of accountability to do analysis so that the bank's board can hold the bank accountable for its work, as well as outside stakeholders being better informed of what the bank has been doing, also as a source of accountability and learning in order to be able to contribute to better operational and developmental results in the future. So I'm going, we did a very rich report that's available online, and that's been condensed into this, this shorter overview that's been made available here. And from there, you'll see executive summaries, and from there, you'll see this PowerPoint with main messages. So everything gets condensed. I do encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to see the main report. But the main messages that I'll be touching on today in this presentation are first that safety net institutions need to be developed during stable times in order to be able to reach the poor and also to serve efficiently and effectively during crisis. This isn't something that can only be thought about during times of crisis. Second, there's more potential for safety net in low-income countries, and the bank has been focusing predominantly in middle-income countries, though certainly has been involved in low-income as well. Third, that results frameworks need sharpening for poverty focus and for long-term objectives. And with regard to this means that the objectives of the projects need to be very, very clearly defined towards poverty, and the design adjusted accordingly and monitored towards those objectives. And that chain needs to be clearer, as well as a broader perspective on long-term objectives. So there are objectives that happen in the short, medium, and longer term, but for development results, the interest is ultimately in some of the longer-term objectives as well. The fourth main message is that the World Bank's strategic engagement is important for effectiveness. Okay, so what definition do we use for social safety nets? We say that social safety nets are non-contributory transfers targeted in some way to the poor and vulnerable. Now, this is a definition used by the operational part of the bank. The definition of safety nets varies between different institutions, between different countries, even within the bank, between academics in the bank and operations. That's okay. There we go. Okay. So the definition varies between different actors, but in order to evaluate this portfolio of effort that the bank has done, we use this operational definition. It includes such programs as cash transfers, food and in-kind transfers, sectoral subsidies, public works programs. Now, the popularity of these programs differ by country income level. So, for example, in low-income countries, in-kind transfers are the most common type of safety net used, and public works programs are the second most common. Whereas you see in middle-income countries that conditional and unconditional transfers are the most popular, and public works programs are much lower down on the type of programs used. Social safety nets, rather than define them solely by programs, which we look at the objectives of them as well, since the programs can serve as social safety nets, but they don't have to serve as safety nets. Depends on how they're designed. So the objectives of safety nets are to reduce chronic poverty and inequality by increasing the consumption of the poorest, to improve investments in human capital of the poor, protect the poor and vulnerable from individual shocks, systemic shocks. And again, it's important we look at the function of safety nets as well as the programs, because we really want to get a sense of what they're trying to achieve and if in fact they are serving the role of safety nets. So the evaluation questions basically are: how effective and relevant has the bank been in helping countries establish sound social safety nets, and what lessons were learned? The methodology was a mix of quantitative and qualitative studies and inputs. We had a portfolio review of the 244 lending operations, so a whole host of variables related to the project as well as the country in which the project was based. An analysis of trust funds, since trust funds serve a very important role with social safety nets, and analytical work, and that's both studies and technical assistance. Since these are all different types of instruments that the bank uses. Case studies, we did case studies of 30 countries, 24 were randomly selected, half a dozen were field-based case studies, the others were in-depth desk-based reviews, and this was important to really understand assess the relevance of the bank's work. You have to look at the context in which the bank was engaged to have an idea of where was it supporting the appropriate areas in that particular country context, and what was driving effectiveness in that case. Did a staff survey regarding the reaction, the country reaction to the food, fuel, and financial crisis. 8 thematic background papers. And we got to benefit from a whole host of impact evaluations. Safety nets have been the most studied area of any sector. And so there were 149 impact evaluations. We did a meta-evaluation looking at what themes were coming out of this, as well as conducted 2 new impact evaluations looking at longer-term effects. Okay, so findings. First, when we assessed every bank project and said what purpose was it trying to serve, and a project could serve more than one purpose, we saw that overwhelmingly the bank's efforts were trying to focus on addressing chronic poverty and inequality. So over 80% of the bank supported projects were trying to address that. A large number were also trying to invest in human capital investment, in the health and education of the population. And a much lower amount, only about half, were trying to address or prepare the country for systemic risks. This is, on one hand, it's not that surprising because a lot of the lending was going to middle-income countries. This was a period of relatively strong growth throughout the decade, and many countries demanded bank services to address pockets of poverty, and they wanted to address, these entrenched pockets. And they were thinking of doing that through various means, including investing in the human capital of children, conditional cash transfers, that type of thing. But when we did the survey of the staff, we found that only 16% felt the countries were well prepared to react to the crisis. And so there really was a a much less of a focus trying to prepare countries for shocks. Nevertheless, we see that the World Bank support did increase with the crisis since 2008. Both the amount committed to projects and the number of projects increased dramatically. So sometimes this was not through necessarily the best instrument that was flexible to adjust to different beneficiaries, but where there were systems in place, the bank was helping to support and reacting in this counter-cyclical way. We assessed the bank over the past decade to look at how much focus was on ad hoc projects versus trying to help countries develop a systemic approach. And we see that there was a lot of improvement throughout the decade. In the first half, only 16% of countries that were being supported were really taking this broader approach of developing the building blocks of safety nets, the data, the targeting, the payment systems, and also trying to assess the complementarity of programs, coordinated safety net programs, so that they can reach different groups of vulnerable populations depending on the nature of the shock or the nature of the issue. So this improves in the second half of the decade, and we see that 45% of the countries studied were dealing with this in a more systemic way. This was a major objective of the last social protection strategy at the beginning of the decade, and they made improvement. There's still a long way to go. It was clear from the case studies that the institutional development was very much valued as a very strong part of bank support. Building the poverty data, the targeting, the payment systems, by stakeholders and by bank staff themselves, they believed that the institution building was the strongest aspect of bank support. Almost half of the safety net projects supported institutional capacity building, but there was a big difference between middle income and lower income countries. 57% of middle-income countries the projects were supporting institutional development, and only 24% in lower-income countries. The most important factors limiting the bank support after the crisis from our survey were weak country data, institutions, and available instruments. So where there lacked the institutions, it was much more difficult for the country and to address the vulnerable populations and for the bank to support them. And certainly, one of the takeaways from this is unless countries prepare the safety net institutions during stable times, they're unable to respond efficiently and effectively during crisis. So there are other mechanisms. There's broad subsidies, food subsidies, but in order to be able to target the poor and have an efficient policy and an effective one at reaching the vulnerable groups, that type of ongoing engagement to do the work in between crises is important. The second main point is middle-income countries got more attention than lower-income countries. So if you look at this first pie chart of the total lending that the bank did over the decade, almost 80% went to middle-income countries and only about 20% to low-income countries. Now, when you look at the number of operations, it's not quite as dramatic because there were more lower-income countries involved. They were just having smaller loans, so it drops to about 62%. But when that's in absolute terms. In proportional terms, really, middle-income countries put greater emphasis, and the bank did as well, on social safety nets than lower-income did. So out of all the lending that went to LICs, only 2% of it was for safety nets, and 6% of lower-income country projects were for safety nets, whereas for middle-income countries, 5% of the bank's lending went for safety nets and 13% of its projects. So really, it was a bigger deal, absolutely and proportionally, in middle-income countries. Now, to get a better understanding of what's driving the lending part of this, we look at the top 10 borrowers, we plot where they are in terms of the amount committed to safety nets along the horizontal axis. And along the vertical axis, we look at the percentage of the total poor people in bank client countries. So you see, first of all, the first notice is most of these countries are middle-income countries. And then you see, for example, the top 3 borrowers, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, represent about 45% of the bank's lending over the decade, and only about 1% of the poor. So whereas you can say, well, the middle-income countries do host most of the world's poor, not the middle-income countries that the bank is lending to. There's other reasons why why they were involved in middle-income countries, such as these are countries that had institutions that wanted to scale up, where there was a demand. There was a lot of learning to be had from these countries that were doing very innovative activities. The lower-income countries tend to do more small scale, have less absorptive capacity. They do pilots. All this doesn't take the same amount of resources. Nevertheless, when you look at the distribution of lending and poverty, that's what you see. And when we aggregate it, we see the top 10 borrowers represent about 72% of lending. And actually, when you look each year, you'll see one or two main borrowers. It's really lumpy in terms of looking at the lending. And in aggregate, that's 72%, and it's about 16% of the world's poor. Okay, the third point is that the short-term results were generally positive. On average, the safety net lending performs better than the rest of the bank portfolio. And you can see that here, the total is 86% of safety net projects rated satisfactory or higher, and only 78% of all other projects at the bank. What's interesting is that this difference was particularly striking for low-income countries. So generally, projects perform worse in low-income countries, but in this case, the safety nets performed even better. And this is across many parameters. So when you look not only at did the project achieve its stated objective, but you look at some indicators of impact. This is from impact evaluations. You see across a range of outcome indicators here, there are also very positive impacts. These are short-term impacts, but positive. However, very few studies monitor really the results chain and examine long-term impacts. So we looked specifically at the case of conditional cash transfers, and we see that they achieve project objectives more often than other safety net instruments. It was the top performer in terms of how many achieved their objectives, yet they focused on outputs or intermediate outcomes. The programs are justified often based on long-term objectives, yet they're monitored and evaluated for short-term achievements. So if the objective is to address intergenerational poverty traps and try to get kids in school so that they can eventually have greater capacity to earn more and have a better well-being, those higher level down the results chain aren't measured. What is measured often is, did the money go to the right household, and did the child go to school? There are some, but very few, evaluations now looking at things like high school retention, but still there's a long way to go in terms of moving down the results chain towards the development objectives on which really the whole project is justified. One of the reasons is it's very challenging. The longer term results require coordinating country demand and supply. So on one hand, you can give the cash transfer to get children to school, but in order for them to learn, they require perhaps better trained teachers, better school services, and that often involves a different ministry. And it's very complicated, particularly within the realm of a project team at the bank or in the country, to be able to have influence on that range of outputs. The bank did do two new impact IEG did two new impact evaluations looking at the longer term impacts. They did one in Colombia and one in Pakistan, and found that it did help children, particularly girls, complete high school, although it didn't have particularly significant improvements in learning outcomes in Colombia. And in Pakistan, it helped girls complete middle school, and it also recorded positive indirect effects like reduced child labor and delayed marriage and lower fertility. So the results are encouraging, but it's still very early on in the results chain, and sometimes with such a wide variety of impacts, these efforts are justified based on some of the indirect impacts. And if in fact, a project is to be justified by delayed marriage and lower fertility, and that's the main reason, then it perhaps behooves them to look at what other interventions, do a cost effectiveness analysis and see what other efforts would be to achieve that objective. So just because it has a range of positive effects doesn't necessarily justify the project. It has to be very clear on what it's trying to achieve and monitor it accordingly. We also found in this results framework story that the short-term safety net objectives were achieved, but the poverty focus needs strengthening. So by definition, by the World Bank's definition, safety nets target the poor, yet more than 40% don't mention the poor in their objectives, and more than 50% don't mention any target population. 50% don't have even one indicator to monitor progress on reaching the poor. And less than 1/3 have time-bound indicators, and less than 1/3 have baseline data before project effectiveness. It doesn't mean that they're not trying to reach the poor by design or by other means, but when we assessed explicit objectives and indicators, that is what we found. So we looked more carefully at the case of the Public Works program, and the most common objective seen was the common Public Works program was short-term employment. 90% of the projects were trying to achieve that, and infrastructure creation. Only 14% indicated the employment targeted to the poor or vulnerable. So these are Public Works programs, but they don't have to be a safety net. These are ones that were considered safety nets, and yet only 14% indicated that the employment was targeted to the poor. The monitoring indicators tended to focus on asset creation or employment opportunities. But a Public Works program is only a safety net if it's actually designed to reach the poor and vulnerable. One of the things we noticed was a gap between the technical knowledge and project design, because certainly all the toolkits at the bank and all the training seminars and all the research acknowledges the importance of all the design details in being able to achieve objectives and target the poor. And yet there is something that doesn't translate very often, or didn't in that decade, towards actually implementing that. For example, like a self-targeted wage is known and written about, and yet there are many that don't actually use that. And we look into that, and one of the reasons is that some of the design details are determined after project effectiveness. And as a result, the leverage the bank has in negotiating with the government on such important design details goes down. And there's a lot of, even though the counterpart may have had good intentions, there's many different stakeholders within a country, and it's hard to follow through necessarily on every one of these details that have ramifications for winners and losers. So there's a need to measure programs against safety net objectives. Okay, the fourth point here is, when we look at how effective and relevant the bank has been in a country and try to explain it, there's a host of factors regarding the country itself. Right, the country's income level, its poverty profile, its institutions, its social contract with the population, a whole range of factors related to the country. There's a range of factors related to the project, such as the results framework. And then there's a whole host of other factors where it does matter how the bank has engaged in the country. And so some of these issues that we looked at were, for example, sustained bank engagement, where the bank has been able to be involved throughout the decade. And it's not just through lending. It could be through studies, through a study tour, through convening power, bringing together different actors at a key time. But having a presence there and being able to identify when are the opportunities to bring together different partners to move forward the agenda, that's very important. To be able to build the institutions, help the country build the institutions, to create greater transparency over poverty, over targeting issues, to have a more meaningful dialogue going on in the country. So when there is some moment of opportunity, which often comes with crisis or change of political leadership, there's a certain ripeness, a maturity. And it doesn't mean that where the bank is engaged in a sustained manner, it necessarily advances, but it's been a critical component of places where it has advanced. Part of this is looking for opportunities to include social safety nets in part of a broader development agenda. It's not just something that's taken up by those in government and those at the bank concerned about social safety nets. It's something that's part of a sustainable growth strategy. It's something that the country director brings up with core ministries, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning. So we saw only 60%, I don't know if it's an only 60% or 60%, but 60% of the countries we examined were including this in the growth agenda. And the broader country dialogue on broad-based sustainable poverty reduction and growth. Political economy knowledge. Safety nets are a very political issue. They involve redistribution. There's a range of stakeholders involved in this. And the ability to move forward on this issue can differ. It can happen, as I said, during after a time of crisis, when there's a particularly strong need to protect vulnerable groups. It could happen with a change of leadership, when there's a particularly fertile environment for dialogue on this issue. And we see that 50% of the big advances were because of new leadership, and 70% were during times of crisis. Having the sustained engagement and the knowledge of what's happening in the country and what's driving it is very important, to being able to know when to use which tools and how to have the biggest impact possible. Internal coordination. Well, safety nets are an issue that's addressed by several different networks within the bank. It's under the responsibility of the social protection group in the Human Development Network, and yet 13 different sector boards. This is internal bank discussion, but basically these projects take place in all different types of sectors. And so coordinating, a few ones dominate, but it's really very, very broad. So coordinating the efforts and assuring the quality control, so that something that's called a safety net is really designed to reach the port, I think, is a challenge. And there are administrative issues to do with budgeting and such, which are more of a concern for our bank audience, but it's raised here and discussed in the report as a set of issues. And then there's external coordination, where we see, particularly in low-income countries, there's been a real donor fragmentation. Now, this often comes because it's an environment where there's a lot of experimentation, small-scale efforts, pilot efforts. Nevertheless, what exists is across the map, lots of little different efforts. And then you see some exceptions to that, like Ethiopia, where donors have really been able to pool together resources with a strong government leadership, and it makes a big difference. And so there are challenges with external coordination, and an important area for reflection. So once again, the main messages are: safety net institutions need to be developed during stable times to reach the poor and serve efficiently and effectively during crisis. There's more potential for safety nets in low-income countries. It's important in middle-income countries too, but a lot needs to be done in low-income countries. Results frameworks need sharpening for poverty focus and long-term objectives, and that strategic engagement by the World Bank is important for its effectiveness. And as I said, the full report is online, and for those interested in this, there's a lot more detail in there. So thank you very much.